Hello, this is Redline TV, and today we're going to have a look at the situation in Scotland. Now, we always knew that what was important in the election was which way Scotland went. And although it was predicted, I cannot but say I was kind of a bit amazed at how much of the Scottish vote went to Labour. I have to say that. As some of you may know, I do go up to Scotland regularly and I've worked in Scotland. So I kind of know or have experienced the antithesis that there has been towards what is seen often as the English Labour Party. But to kind of pick that out a bit and to see whether this swing to the Labour Party is sustainable and what it's all about, we have Mike Cowley from the editorial board. Mike Cowley is an activist, he's a trades unionist, he works in further education, and he's a just general good person to be speaking about this. Hi, Mike, how are you doing?
Hi, Jackie. Good, thank you. It's a mixed picture up here, Jackie, that there are continuities with the rest of the UK in terms of the political landscape, but as always in Scotland, there are peculiarities as well. Just to give you some of the data, again, while the Labour Party increased its vote share by a considerable amount, 16% in Scotland, that was still only a 35% vote share. So it's marginally better than what the UK party achieved down south, but nonetheless, it's not a ringing endorsement. What's really happened up here, alongside obviously the collapse of the Tories, is a partial collapse, not quite the calamitous decline that was predicted, of the SNP, who lost 15% vote share. So, and obviously there's a politics to that and a history to that. The SNP have not had to seek their troubles. There are criminal allegations pending against some of their leading members. Nicola Sturgeon is caught up in that in terms of misappropriation of party funds. There has been the very poor records that they could bring to the electorate on educational attainment, child poverty, drugs deaths, and so on. And one of the key differences in the general election up here, Jackie, which distinguishes it from previous elections, particularly Scottish elections, is that for once, the terrain wasn't constitutional. It was fought on social issues and economic issues, which of course favours the Labour Party and does not favour the SNP, who like to remain rooted in the constitutional question and hope to narrow the political discussion to a binary question of unionism or independence. So while there's been significant gains for the Labour Party up here, obviously, my own constituency now has a Labour MP. Really, whether the SNP can recover, and there's still the government up here until 2025, the next Scottish elections are scheduled for, really whether the Labour Party can sustain its advance in Scotland, and I guess as you alluded to in the UK as a whole, is largely contingent on what happens between now and 2025. Will the SNP be able to look back and say this has been a missed opportunity these 2 years? The indicators of inequalities, poverty, and so on have not improved in Scotland. Therefore, their old argument about the Labour Party not delivering can be reinstated, and they may find their feet again. In contrast, if the Labour Party can show some kind of record that they can go to the public on in 2025, that's going to make life very hard for the SNP. Their whole case, Jackie, as you know, over the last 10, 15 years is that, and this is why they're in a wee bit of trouble up here, the English, as they tend to caricature them as a homogenous group, are intrinsically conservative and will always vote for the Conservative Party as a majority. Therefore, the only way we can escape this is by going independent. The problem for them now is that the Tories have imploded in England as well as Scotland and Wales, of course. So that argument that we are doomed to perpetual Tory governments unless we separate from the rest of the United Kingdom cannot be made. So there's a real strategic problem facing the SNP right now.
So what would the Labour government have to do you think, to really sway it for them in 2025?
I don't think it's any different to what they have to do in the rest of the UK, Jackie, in which, I mean, Rachel Reeves in advance has told us that they are not prepared to do, and that's really go to the roots of poverty, of inequality, and to challenge the systemic drivers of those inequalities and that poverty, which, as we know, has escalated over the last half century. We've all been subject to a neoliberal experiment, and we're all suffering the consequences of that. So, but I guess such as establishment politics, if they can point to one or two advances, that might be enough to at least sustain, if not improve, on their vote in 2025. Again, the SNP have got the problem of being an incumbent and being an incumbent for an awful long time. And they've got to demonstrate a record. So it could be that the Scottish Labour Party win by default in 2025 just because people are sick of the SNP and its record. What's interesting, Jackie, is support for independence still remains pretty high here. Mm. It's certainly in the 40% and fairly consistent. The real, amongst a number of crises for the SNP, some of which I mentioned a moment ago, is that the high point in 2014, when the SNP under Sturgeon were seen as the vehicle for independence, and were subject to an awful lot of goodwill amongst people of all kinds of politics, because it was them and them alone who would lead Scotland to the promised land of independence under Salmond and then Sturgeon. People have lost faith in the SNP as a vehicle, and that kind of headiness. I wasn't part of that campaign, but I'm not someone who supports independence, though I sympathise with the arguments that are tabled by comrades on the left. The SNP are no longer seen as a vehicle for independence. That's the first problem. The second problem is, as I say, that intoxicating Yes campaign, which was a really impressive campaign and really grassroots and really mobilised a sense of a possibility amongst a lot of young people as well, has really dissipated. It doesn't exist. To all intents and purposes, it doesn't really exist anymore. While that mood for change, constitutional change, is still strong, it's lost its momentum, it's lost its spark, and it's lost a political focus to take it forward.
So where are the Greens in this? Because, I mean, the Greens made quite a few inroads in the UK, yeah, did independence. Was there anything like that going on in Scotland?
I guess, unfortunately, for people who may invest in the Greens, the answer is no. They did improve and significantly improve their vote share, Jackie, but Reform, who came on the scene in Scotland for the first time as well as around the UK, their vote share was double that of the Greens. Now, the Greens have been at 7%. Now, that's out of nowhere. So it shows again that this sense of Scottish exceptionalism, that we are a uniquely progressive country. There are differences up here, of course, but people forget that we were the only country in the UK to vote as a majority for the Conservatives up to the 1950s, largely based on, not exclusively, but a Protestant working class vote who had a unionist affiliation with the Conservative Party. That's declined dramatically, that kind of ethnic working class vote. But the Greens have also got a wee bit of an issue, because they were, of course, part of the government until very recently. They jumped just before they were about to be pushed by Humza Yousaf. that has contributed to, I think, one or two problems for both of them. They are, to a degree, the Greens, tainted by association with the Scottish Government and its record, and the SNP, in turn, are tainted by their inability to hold on to that governing agreement with the Green Party. So progressives who maybe hoped that there was a kind of green nationalist relationship that they could buy into, they can no longer buy into that. So there was an improvement in the Greens' vote share, but obviously under first past the post, that didn't translate into seats. But it's nowhere near, in fact, it's half the vote share that Reform achieved.
Okay, so that's a bit of a worry, isn't it? But actually, the astonishing thing, I think, is to hear how similar the political scene has become in Scotland. There seemed to me a time when, we were talking about very different political contexts that we were working in. Now it seems, the Labour government, both here and the Scottish Labour, get in, but they almost get in by default, really. Yeah. So there's a kind of well of discontent that's actually going on. How would you put Scottish Labour? Tell me about Scottish Labour. Are they attracting people? Is the membership going? What's happening in Scottish Labour?
I mean, first of all, Jackie, you're absolutely right. That's one of the continuities, I guess, around Europe and North America is not a wholesale collapse, but certainly the data demonstrates that there is a dangerous withdrawal of consent amongst people for the political classes and their institutions. I mean, we've my union has just had a ballot on strike action and further education. We achieved a larger share of our members than political parties did. 62% of our members showed out. And that's larger than people who voted in our general election. So there is there's an issue for the political system up here as well of credibility. But in terms of the Labour Party, we are led by Anas Sarwar, who is firmly on the right of the party, but he's operating, Jackie, in a different political landscape. The SNP have been very, very effective over the last 10, 15, 20 years of positioning themselves to the left of the Labour Party. Now that, for me, they have done so erroneously and without a justification, and they're a party that we often accuse of being more associated with words than deeds, but nonetheless that strategy has been very effective, essentially because the Scottish Labour Party, as with the UK Labour Party, have vacated that ground. Sarwar, therefore, has to operate in different circumstances. To give you some examples, Jackie, when Starmer was threatening his front bench and other MPs with removal of the whip, should they attend picket lines, Sarwar was on picket lines up here. Now, that is probably a wee bit outside his comfort zone, but it's a demonstration that he feels he has to, at least performatively in some ways, because it doesn't cost any Labour leader very much to appear in a picket line for strikes that are actually supported by the general public. So he appeared on picket lines. He came out, to give him his due, very quickly for a ceasefire in Gaza, long before the case was made by the UK front bench, long before. And he has come out fairly bluntly for the immediate repeal of the two-child cap. Now, those are, again, it's probably safer, given those decisions are not his to make, it's probably safer for him to come out and say these things, that he's not using up very much political capital, and it more or less resonates with the majority of the Scottish public at any rate. So whether he can be pushed further in that direction remains to be seen. Whether, when push comes to shove, if the Scottish Labour Party did win in 2025, how he would govern, that obviously remains to be seen as well. In terms of the Scottish Labour Party left, there was a number of candidates who approached the Campaign for Socialism, which is the organisation on the Scottish Labour Party left that predates Momentum. Some of them were refused. because we didn't feel they had the political history or credentials to justify an endorsement. We did endorse one person, Brian Leishman in Grangemouth. He won his seat, so that we are sending one MP from up here to, I hope, the Socialist Campaign Group. I met Brian in a Zoom meeting for the first time the other day. He seems a good comrade, but what's a little bit disappointing is that Brian said that he was uncomfortable with the prospect, when asked, of signing the two amendments to the King's speech on arms sales to Gaza and the two-child cap. He felt that it was too early to stick his head above the parapet. Well, obviously, some of us were saying, look, Brian, if you're a left-wing MP, your cards are marked anyway. So, you're not going to lose very much. I don't think you're on Keir's Christmas card list as it is, so you need to stick with it.
I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing how long it takes people to get this message. I mean, Jonathan Ashworth, who lost his seat, was on TV yet again. I mean, just constantly moaning about people having the temerity kind of not to vote for him. But he made this really snide comment about the left, which reminded me about the comment that was made about shaking off the fleas, if you remember, which was allegedly made by someone like Luke Hayhurst. I think that was what people were alleging it was anyway. And what he said was, well, I don't think, Starmer's going to give a damn what the left-wing MPs do. Let them vote that. Who cares what they're doing? And it kind of reminded me of that arrogance, that hubris that the right have at the moment. And it's really unfortunate, isn't it, when left-wing MPs play into that? I mean, what do they think, that the right is suddenly going to change their mind and sort of listen to them?
Yeah, I appreciate it, and I'm probably more sympathetic to left MPs and other comrades on the RLTV editorial board, Jackie. They're working in very difficult circumstances, but I do share your frustrations. I think on occasion, with exceptions like Zara Sultana, just to name one who I think has been excellent, on occasions we could do more, and I don't think there's a great deal to lose by doing more. Listen, the strategy is not to persuade the Labour cabinet to move one way or the other on the substantive issues. They've made their ideological trajectory very clear. I think they're open to political pressure on the two-child cap. I think probably that will be abolished. But every day that passes is another day that hundreds of thousands of children are living in poverty. So I think, yes, the campaign group, the left of the Labour Party, have got some hard thinking to do. We all do, I guess, about how we orientate towards a new political landscape. We're all celebrating getting rid of the Tories. What a horrific bunch of ruling class spivs they were, and we should enjoy their implosion. But we have to recalibrate and rethink, okay, we've now got a Labour government. It's not committed to transformative politics of any kind. In fact, it's very clear on its trajectory. But is it open to... What my fear is, Jackie, is that we fall into a habit of limiting our ambitions to squeeze in the best we can get out of the Labour government. And listen, that's part of our tactics, of course, because every material gain is a material gain for ordinary people. That has to be, we've got to squeeze the best we can. But we can't limit ourselves to that, because we may win concessions and we may build our capacity on the basis of campaigning for those concessions, but we have to think more widely about how do we rejuvenate our communities. And let me share one thing that I'm going to try and do in my own CLP, and I would encourage everyone to do in whatever circumstances they're in. I'm going to propose our CLP initiates, along with the local trades council, community councils, local campaign groups, a citizens' assembly. Now, most CLPs will reject that, because most CLPs are led by people who have got an elitist view of politics. Politics is for men in suits. It's not for communities. But in those CLPs who do take it up, and there are CLPs who still have left majorities, it will potentially could lock the Labour movement into local concerns, into local campaigns, and leverage influence that way. There's no doubt, last thing I'll say on this, Jackie, that we've got to do something, because we all know you don't have to be a scholar of history to know that where vacuums open up,
yeah,
and there is a massive political vacuum, and the general election data demonstrates that, those are very dangerous times for everyone, for minorities, for working class people, and so on. Socialists cannot stand aside from that danger. We've got to, as you say, and RLTV are always at pains to say, the left, similar to the French left, have got to understand the urgency of the times. And we've got to figure out a strategy that we can all minimally get behind, whether that's inside or outside the Labour Party.
Okay, well, thinking about that, one thing I'd like to ask you about is migration, because of course migration in England has been a real wedge issue, I would say. And when I'm talking about a wedge issue, I'm talking about the way that Reform have come in and used it as a way to really develop a remarkable amount of political support for a new party. But all the political parties, well, not all of them, of course, but both main political parties are using it to their own ends. Now, it rings differently in Scotland, doesn't it? Because you have a real labour shortage and you have a population shortage. So how does Reform fit into that picture in Scotland? How have they managed? You know, what's the basis of their support in Scotland?
Well, that's a very good question, Jackie. We don't have the levels of immigration that England have. For example, we are a multicultural society, obviously going back hundreds of years. We were certainly, despite the protestations of some nationalists, very much part of empire. And we have a colonial history, Scotland up here.
I know that myself.
Indeed.
I've got two Scottish great grandparents, so I know that myself. And it wasn't because they were here; it's because they were in the Caribbean, as were many Scottish people.
Yeah, and as you know, Jackie, there's plenty of statues and street names around here that speak of our colonial past. But I guess we're talking about, in that sense, a kind of latent racism that has never disappeared from all over the UK, and is may not be as intensively experienced in Scotland, but it's nonetheless present. And yes, we have labour shortages. It's also a reserved area. So the Scottish Parliament have not had any political pressure to do one thing or the other, because it can't do one thing or the other. So that, a far right kind of moral panic around what the Scottish Parliament is or isn't doing around immigration is not available to Reform here. I think that 7% vote share essentially comes from, and let's be blunt, a layer of racists in Scotland who want to vote for racist parties. They may not say so explicitly. Probably a fear of the prospect of immigration rather than its actual fact. As we know, many of the most reactionary constituencies in terms of voting patterns don't actually experience immigration.
For sure.
One of the beautiful stories to tell about immigration is when people do mix, people do experience each other, they rub together pretty well, and they come to an accommodation with each other. So I guess in many ways, Scotland has never really been tested in terms of its the political composition of ordinary people and their views on immigration. But there's no doubt that, I mean, a 7% vote share from its very first election in Scotland is and double that of the Greens, who actually improved their vote share, but not nearly as much as Reform tell us. As you'll know from your own experiences, that we cannot be complacent up here.
Yeah, and I think that's a real good message for us all, is that, you know, you can say it's a fault of migration as much as you like, but there is a significant residue from the history of empire and slavery that runs throughout the structures of this whole United Kingdom,
Absolutely.
and for very good reasons. So, okay, so one thing you didn't answer, which I would like to know, is have you got any idea what's happening in terms of Labour Party membership in Scotland? What's happening on the ground? You know, what's the I from what I hear, Labour Party meetings in England are now a pretty much a dirge affair. People don't go, they're very often not quorate, they're not allowed to speak about a huge amount of things. Most people don't, you know, they're kind of, it's emptied out. That's basically what it is now. The constituencies, the democracy level at constituency level is basically emptied out, which is a real significant problem, and I think one that we don't talk about enough. So I know that that's happening in England. What's happening in Scotland at constituency level?
And we have to remember, Jackie, of course, that this is part of the neoliberal project, is to remove
Yes.
people from politics altogether and to restore the right to make decisions to a elitist clique. And the Corbyn phenomena, as it was a riposte to that. It brought hundreds of thousands of people into politics. So in terms of, you're right, Jackie, what's happening in Scotland, while the engineered moral panic over anti-Semitism did not take as firm a hold of the party up here, nonetheless, there were issues with it. I've shared my own experiences with the RLTV before. I know one comrade who's been expelled, one other very high-profile member who was investigated and subsequently left the party. I can only really, I guess, speak in detail from my own CLP. I've not gone for a couple of months, Jackie, I'll be honest. And I could not, after a vote that on a motion I tabled on an immediate ceasefire for Gaza, when some of the contributions, it was difficult to hear. Listen, I respect anyone who steps up for political activity. Not many people do. Most people sit in their hands and live out their lives. But when I heard some of those contributions, which were just appalling, and particularly from what we now know about what's going on in Israel in Gaza and the West Bank day in, day out, they're just unconscionable. And I felt at that point, I cannot knock doors alongside some of these people, not all of them by any means, but I just, there's a line in the sand with your own personal conscience at some point. So there are still left CLPs, absolutely, that have left majorities and are able to do a lot more. My own CLP, and without being ungenerous to anyone, of course, who finds the time in their lives to step up, it is a little bit hollowed out. It's often not quoted. They are, I have to be candid, they are not the most interesting of meetings, because one of the things that strikes me about the right wing of the Labour Party is their lack of curiosity in what socialists actually believe and think. They're just not interested. It's a strange.
I think they're fundamentally interested in power.
Yes.
Rather than in actually changing things. I mean, I think there's a real irony that Starmer's Labour chose change as their motif. Because actually, in a way, they were being truthful. You know, they were saying, vote for change to keep things the same. And they're absolutely right. Vote for change to keep things exactly the same. And to actually do that, you don't need to find out what people think, because you're going to keep things exactly the same as they are.
Exactly. Exactly. And that, when you are debating and discussing with people whose view of politics is how do we get our tribe into the corridors of power, you're not dealing with good faith actors, Jackie, because they're actually not that curious or interested in
And it's
any
boring.
question beyond that. Yeah.
It's fundamentally boring. Now, just to end with, and I know
Sure.
that you have some experience with this at the moment, I'd like to talk a bit about the situation with the trades unions and industrial relations, because you can see what's happening, certainly in the rest of the UK, where you have, there's meetings with doctors going on. There was discussion yesterday about public sector workers and the fact that they might have to push it to get 5%, and that the government are concerned that otherwise they're going to get strikes. You can see this kind of pressure beginning to build up. How are things going in terms of, because you're one thing you are is an active trades unionist, Mike.
Yeah, I've just hot-footed it to our discussion, Jackie, from EISFL, a national committee, where we were discussing what was really an extraordinary ballot result. Extraordinary because people were voting over the holidays, so there's not a chance for reps to speak to people, to mobilise people and encourage people. We've got a very strong mandate for strike action when the new term commences in August. It's obviously within a devolved area of education, so our target is not only our employers but the Scottish Government as well. So we've got real momentum in Grangemouth. There, where I think Unite organise, there is the threat of the closing down of a refinery.
Yeah.
Which, listen, many workers would like to see it closed down, but with a just transition, using their skills to move towards a more sustainable form of industrial activity. So there's a big demonstration on Saturday, which I'm hoping to get through. The Campaign for Socialism MP, Brian Leishman, actually represents a part of that area, so he has been working very hard to support them. Again, the Scottish trade union movement has been very, very good. The STUC produced a report demonstrating how the Scottish Parliament could use its devolved levers to raise billions of pounds every year. So it is, and Ros Foy is a fantastic General Secretary, very much on the left of the movement. But we're up against the same challenges of the kind of inequalities, the kind of poverty that our members experience and see every day. And I guess to a degree, we're waiting to see what kind of legislation comes through, and whether and to what degree that frees up trade unionists to assert themselves more effectively. I guess that's the primary concern right now. What kind of legislation is coming, and how can we use that?
Well, I think that's been a really useful discussion, certainly for me. It's kind of explained to me more how the whole thing fits together, and why people in Scotland would have voted for what many of us feel are more of the same in the kind of ways they did. Mike, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you to the viewers as well. Bye-bye.
Thanks, comrades.